So welcome back, everybody. This is the third of today's panel discussions. Cartographic Encounters with Contemporary Exploring. My name is Tom Allen, and I'm the Expedition and Fieldwork Manager here at the RGS, where I help deliver the Society's support for geographical exploration in its many forms. And we're very lucky to be joined for this session by two of our most esteemed contemporary explorers. Our first panelist is Felicity Aston, a polar scientist, record-breaking explorer, and leader of numerous international expeditions to the Arctic and Antarctic. Felicity was the first woman in the world to ski solo across Antarctica, a 59-day, 1,744-kilometre journey that earned her the RGS's Polar Medal. And our second panelist is Phoebe Smith, an award-winning travel writer, broadcaster, and winner of the RGS's Ness Award, who finds wildness and adventure in the margins of our everyday maps, demonstrating that exploration is not just about distant continents, but about finding the hidden, unmapped experiences in our own backyards. So if you've just joined us, either online or in person, the format for the session includes short talks by our two panelists, followed by a panel discussion, and then for the last 15 minutes, question and answers from the audience. And if you're online, you can ask your questions online in the text box below the stream. And if you're in the room, feel free to use the postcards or pieces of paper on your seats to jot down your questions. Just hold them up, somebody will collect them, and we'll get through as many of those as we can in the last 15 minutes or so. So could Felicity please come up? Thank you.
Well, I've been fortunate enough to spend the last 25, 30 years preparing and taking part in expeditions, mostly to the polar regions, but to all sorts of remote regions of the world. And so my life on a day-to-day basis is intricately linked with maps, either by inspiration, getting the inspiration for what the next expedition is going to be, or planning those ideas and then carrying them out. But also the other half of my life, which is involved in scientific inquiry, using maps in all sorts of ways other than for navigation, using maps to display scientific data to gain greater understanding than you might get from just gazing at the landscape. But when I was trying to think about what stories I'd want to share today, there were three particular encounters with maps that I thought were fairly illustrative. And the first one that came to mind was 25 years ago. It was my first proper job after university, and I was posted to an Antarctic research station with the British Antarctic Survey. And I was there as a meteorologist. And one of the biggest perks of that job was that once a year I would have to fly to all the automatic weather stations that were scattered across particularly East Antarctic ice sheet to maintain it, the annual sort of maintenance flight, to go and make sure that that automatic weather station would work properly for the following year. And so what that meant was that I got to make these incredible flights across Antarctica. These are experiences that money literally cannot buy you. We would fly for hours over these huge Antarctic ice sheets that maybe a handful of people had ever set eyes on before, never mind landed and tinkered around with machinery for a while. And these journeys, mostly, you were looking out at just this flat white horizon, this typical sort of ice sheet landscape. But I remember on one particular journey, it was just me and the pilot in the plane, and we'd been flying for hours looking out at just big flat white nothingness. And then down to my right, I spotted this sort of picture-perfect dreamscape of a little mountain. And it was the sort of mountain range that you might draw as a child, a mountain range of your imagination. Big pointy mountain in the middle, surrounded by a horseshoe of little serrated mountains. And I said through my headset to the pilot, "What's that mountain range down there? It's beautiful." And he looked at the map that he had, that he was flying from, and he said, "Oh, I don't know, it's not on the map." And then I took the map from him because I couldn't quite believe it. This is a whole massive mountain range and it doesn't even appear on the map. That, by the way, we're using to fly, navigate our way across Antarctica. And I looked down at the map and I remember distinctly seeing, close to where we were, a little note written on the map that said, "Mountains reported 1963. That's all it said. Now, when I was putting together this talk, I tried to find that map because at the back of my mind, I'm slightly worried that maybe I've misremembered. This was 20 or more years ago. So I looked at all the maps that we might have been using on that journey. There's not many of them. And I couldn't find that comment, "Mountains reported 1963. But I did find on a jet nautical chart, which is a jet navigation chart rather, which is likely what we were using. These sorts of comments: deep crevasses reported 1963, crevasses reported 1966. Now, crevasses aren't mountain ranges, crevasses move around, and it makes absolute sense that these comments would be on this chart. But I hope that this does give me a little bit of reassurance that maybe I didn't completely imagine that it said mountains reported 1963. But of course, Antarctica is really problematic to map. We talked, it was mentioned earlier about how projections that are used distort our perception of the world around us. And nowhere is that so true than of Antarctica. We're used to seeing Antarctica as this vague white mass at the bottom of the world map in every classroom around the world. And this really hides the true nature of Antarctica. If you look at Antarctica using other projections, you start to see the true scale of the place. Antarctica is twice the size of the continent of Australia, and yet, we think of Australia as a massive place, and perhaps we didn't realise that it pales in comparison to Antarctica. And yet, of course, Antarctica is completely empty. So there's lots of reasons why Antarctica is problematic to map, and this has resulted in there not being a lot of maps of Antarctica around. This is the set that is used most commonly, jet navigation charts. These were all created between 1950 and 1970 something for the US Air Force by the Defense Mapping Agency of the US. And you can see there in the middle that the whole of the Antarctic continent is actually covered by just 6 sheets of this map series. And the vast majority of the continent appears in just the central 2, sheet 124 and 121. So 10 years later, when I was preparing for my solo ski across Antarctica, my first port of call was this series of maps to find, okay, I need a map to be able to navigate across Antarctica. And these maps are absolutely huge. This is sheet 121 from this series, and you can see that the South Pole is that sort of circle you can see on the left-hand side. And it covers pretty much the whole of the East Antarctic ice sheet. So that's an area roughly the size of Australia right there, covered on one sheet. And they're physically massive too. When I had a copy of this map sent to me, I unfolded it, and I unfolded it, and I unfolded it, and I unfolded it, and then it fell to the ground. Absolutely massive. So for my purposes, to be able to plot my traverse of the Antarctic landmass, it wasn't terribly useful. And yet I spent an awful lot of time carefully cutting out just the areas that I was likely to encounter. And what I was left with was largely a white sheet of paper with nothing on it. So why did I bother? Why did I go to all the trouble of printing out these sheets of paper? And the reason was not for navigation. The reason these maps were so important to me is because every evening it became part of my ritual that I'd get into my tent, I'd unfold the maps, and I would mark on that map where I was. And that was important to give me a sense of where I was and what I was doing, but also that I had moved from where I was the previous day, that I was making progress, that I was fulfilling the purpose of being out there. And so this psychological need to put myself on the map was much greater than any navigational purpose of this map. And I thought that was really interesting, the reason that we need maps and the meaning that we place on maps. But there are lots of places that are far harder to map than even Antarctica. And one of the hardest places in the world, you could even arguably say it's unmappable, is the Arctic Ocean. The Arctic Ocean is an ocean mass that's covered with a relatively thin layer of ice, and that layer of ice is constantly moving. Sometimes different areas of ice push together to form big mounds of ice rubble that we call pressure ridges. Other times that ice separates to form big areas of open water that we call leads. And this topography is constantly changing, and so therefore you can never have a map of it. So when it came to planning a ski to the North Pole, which is roughly in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, there was no map to be able to tell us where we were or what direction we should go. There was no map in order to navigate, but we drew our own. This is our hand-drawn map of the Arctic Ocean. And in the middle, you can see, like the center of a dartboard, there's 90 degrees north, and then radiating out are all the lines of longitude. And these little blue dots you can see in the top right-hand corner, each blue dot represents a place where we set up a camp. And what's interesting about this map is that the forward progress we're making towards the bullseye, towards the North Pole in the middle of this map, that's us doing that. That's us moving forward on our skis, moving towards the North Pole. But you can see that we're also making progress in a sort of clockwise direction. That's not us doing that. That's the ice that's moving under our skis. It's carrying us in a clockwise direction. And so this map revealed a truth about moving across this landscape that was completely invisible to us from the surface. And that was that if we took too long about reaching the North Pole, we would find ourselves being moved down towards the bottom of this map. And that would be an area that we call negative drift. This is where that movement of the ice is carrying you away from the North Pole faster than you can ever ski towards it. It's like suddenly being the wrong way on a conveyor belt, trying to go backwards on an escalator. It doesn't work. And that's not clear to see from the landscape itself. It's only through maps like this that you can see how that works, and it instantly impacts your navigation. But the final map that I wanted to share with you came about on this expedition. This was the Pole of Cold expedition, which started from right here in the RGS, and then we travelled in this Land Rover all the way across to a place known as the Pole of Cold in northeast Siberia. It's the coldest inhabited place in the world. And so the last leg of that journey was making this huge long drive across the vast expanse of Siberia, and it's just endless landscape. And I wasn't able to get any maps of any useful scale for a lot of northeast Siberia. I just couldn't access it. I tried all the normal places, all the normal stores of knowledge, and I couldn't really find anything very useful. So when we arrived in the main city in the whole of the Yakutsk region of northeast Siberia, we started to ask around, where can we purchase a map? And the response that we got was one of complete bewilderment. What are you talking about? What do you need a map for? Why do you want a map? There are no maps. And what I got told, and I will never forget it, was that there is only one road and everybody knows where it goes. So you don't need a map. And we were seen as complete imbeciles for asking for it to be written down because it was so obvious. But there were maps. It's just that the maps didn't take on the form that we recognise in European science as cartography. The maps were all in people's heads, in their knowledge, as we were talking about in the previous session. And so we did a 4,000 kilometre stretch back from Yakutsk towards Moscow, most of it done on rivers rather than roads, frozen rivers. And this was the only map that we had to tell us the way. And this was from the jotting downs of people that we passed, that we met in the little roadside cafes, and they told us, and this thing here that's BS, the round circle in the middle of it, BS stands for Big Stone. So we were told in about 4 days, the road, in the middle of the road, you'll see a big stone, and the road will fork, and you can take either of those. They all go to the same place. So it was just wonderful. But I think it really illustrates how maps can take on all sorts of different forms, and we as Europeans are prejudiced towards what a map should look like. But I'm glad to say that I think maybe our thoughts are widening out. But one last comment is that when I first started doing expeditions, I was told regularly, you can't call yourself an explorer if you're not drawing maps. And there was this whole conversation about what made an explorer. If you're not drawing maps, then how can you call yourself an explorer? Well, now I'm happy to report that I think generally understanding is that you can explore in many different ways. So I hope that similarly, we are learning to understand that maps can provide much more than just topographical orientation. Something else that I'm told a lot as an explorer is, oh, well, the world is a very small place. There's nothing left to explore. And that always makes me think about those air charts in Antarctica, Mountains Reported, 1963. Now there are very detailed satellite-produced maps using satellite data of Antarctica and probably every corner of our planet. But just because we have this massive overview doesn't mean that we understand the detail on the ground. There are huge areas of Antarctica that we may know what is there, but no human footfall has been there. So there's so much more to explore and to discover, and I think maps can help us identify those knowledge gaps and what we still have to learn. So maps, like exploration, help us form our understanding of the world around us, but also the world within us too, the psychology, the relationships of different cultures, the relationship to nature. They give us identity, and they allow us to identify knowledge gaps for the future. And so there's a co-enrichment between maps and exploration that I don't think will ever change. So perhaps those that said you're not an explorer if you're not making maps might have been right after all, but with the caveat that the types of map we make, the ways in which we make those maps, and the purpose of making those maps have changed. And I think that our appreciation for all forms of map making as being of equal value and importance, and the diversity of ways in which we make maps today, has changed map making, but has also changed exploration for the better. And I hope that's a trend that continues into the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Felicity. Wow, I love that, Felicity. What a great segue into what I'm going to talk about, because I often don't feel like much of an explorer or adventurer, even though people tell me I'm crazy, some of the stuff that I do. But yeah, so maps. For me, I wanted to talk a little bit about, I didn't come from a very scientific background at all, and for me, maps, it was always about how can I find a meaning in them? How can I actually understand them? Because I really think at the core, as Felicity's just said, that one of the reasons we have maps is to make a meaning. So this map that I wanted to start with, which is kind of the main thrust behind it, is one that's called the Gough Map. Has anyone seen it before in the room? So a few of you have done. It's basically one of the earliest, or the earliest sheet map of Britain, created sometime, they think, between 1390 and 1410. And there's really little known about who commissioned it and what its purpose was. It shows different topographical features like rivers, it shows mountains, islands, and over 600 settlements. And they seem to be located on what people have theorised have been important roads that people travel on. There's red lines, as you can see. And also another quirk of it, in case you're looking at it thinking, I remember when I first saw it, I thought, is that like Cornwall? Is that at the bottom there? But actually, it's because it's that way round. So they did it so that east was at the top. Because why not? We're the ones who always are obsessed that north has to be at the top. So you can compare what they did back then to something very much more contemporary, and you can see the difference. And to me, let's be honest, for me, looking at the Gough Map, I think it's really beautiful. I think some of us would happily put it on our wall as something like a work of art. And that's the thing, I think, because maps have definitely changed since the Gough Map came out. And when I first was introduced to maps and the idea of maps within geography at school, I found it very difficult to kind of get my head around them. You know, I was a kid shown this kind of OS map, and all I saw was numbers, and I had to know grid references, and I had to work out timings. And for someone whose brain is way more on the creative scale of things than the mathematical and scientific scale of things, I found it hugely off-putting. It was almost like I could look at a landscape and feel like I wanted to be in it, but as soon as I was presented this tool, which I was told I needed to be able to get in it and understand it and explore it, my brain kind of shut down. It was like a barrier, and I found map reading really, really difficult. And so I didn't have a good teacher that could kind of excite me and want me to help me learn about how to read a map. I just found it, my brain just kind of shut down. So I didn't do it. I grew up in North Wales, in a pretty rough area on the coast that was known by the national press as the Costa del Dole. So that gives you an idea of the opportunities we had there. So even though Snowdonia was really close, I didn't explore it. I didn't know how. I didn't know where I was allowed to go. I didn't know what I was allowed to do. The maps had no meaning to me. But then fast forward to 2001, and my mum died of cancer. I was 19. And before she died, the only person she'd spoken to about what she wanted to happen to her when she died was me. And she had said she wanted her ashes scattered on Tryfan, a mountain in Snowdonia. The reason being that whenever you drove back into North Wales on the A55, on a clear day, you could make out the summit of Tryfan really clearly because it's a very distinct looking mountain. So suddenly she'd gone, we had the ashes, and I needed to get onto Tryfan to do what she wanted me to do. And so I had to learn how to use one of these maps that had never made any sense to me to get myself out there. And so instead, how I did it was that I focused on the names rather than all the lines and the maths and the numbers. And I started looking at names, and names in particular in Wales. I don't know how many of you are from there or know it well. The Welsh names of places, and this is a lot like when you travel anywhere, the indigenous names of places tend to tell you quite a lot about a place. You know, if we look at this part of the map from OS 17 on the Gliders, which obviously is right next to Tryfan, you know, you have Glidderfach, which is heap of stones, which beautifully describes exactly what you find when you get to the top of Glidderfach. They also have a formation on there called Castelli Gwynt, which means Castle of the Winds. And for anyone who's been on top of this peak and seen all these spikes of rock formed together, it does look like a castle. And it definitely is windy every time I've been there. And even Tryfan, they think it comes from an old Welsh word that meant three rocks, three distinct summits, which, you know, seeing it from the distance over there, it definitely does have that kind of three raises that go along it. So it all sort of makes sense. And of course, once I'd got my head around things a little bit differently, following my nose, bit of women's intuition, I did make it. And it's somewhere, it's a mountain that I love so much and feel like is part of my family, and I go back a lot, all the time. But that kind of really kick-started for me exploration and discovering what was on my own backyard, the place where I grew up. And so I went back and looked at Snowdonia, and I revisited it by re-looking at the maps first. And again, not the numbers, but the words. And there's so many names, again, like I said, on Welsh maps that talk about Welsh princesses in folklore, and they talk about fables of the sleeping giant. You know, Snowdon, whose name has recently been changed back to the Welsh name, is I'r, which actually means a tomb, and that's because they believe it was the giant Rita Gawr who was laid to rest there after he was beaten. So it was actually the tomb of a giant on this mountain. And I think once you start hearing these things, more landmarks make sense to you. There's a place in Snowdonia called Afon Goch, which means the Red River. And there's so many fables about red rivers. But in this particular place, I found a passage in a book that describes that river as a vitriolic liquors flowed out of the mountain, taken for ulcers, itches, internal hemorrhaging, worms, and diarrhea. Probably actually is because this red river is because of the ore, the iron ore that exists and actually was mined. And suddenly it made sense. I knew where the mine was. I knew where this river was. I understood the name. And I started to almost piece everything together like a jigsaw puzzle. And it really was the key for me to starting to really understand, I shot forward then, to really start to understand maps. And it really did unlock the world for me and helped me engage with the world in a different way. And I started to call map reading, but reading the maps in a very different way. Because I think when you learn things like why a col is called something, for instance, one on I'r, which is called Bwlch y Sithau, which means the pass of the arrows, which is where King Arthur was hit in battle and fell down into the lake at the bottom. You don't get lost there anymore because you recognize that place on a very different level. And so it did unlock the world. And I went and did adventures in Antarctica, in Greenland, in the UK, both of these bottom shots here. The one on the far corner there is when I walked the length of mainland Britain with my friend Dwayne. And we stopped at a monastery, but we walked, and we actually used Google Maps to do that walk because you can see we're pulling wheeled sleds. We didn't need OS maps for that. We couldn't take them on traditional footpaths and bridleways. We needed proper roads and tarmac to take them on to do a 40-day expedition that we did. And so now whenever I go somewhere, I try and learn about the place first, and the people and the culture and the names and the words, and then I put it together onto the map. And I think that really has sort of unlocked, like I said, the world. And I thought, I always was a bit of an outlier. I'm just a woman who needs her own way with this muddled brain to be able to understand maps. But I think the Gough Map does challenge that thought, because the Gough Map, which is our earliest one, it's very illustrative. It shows beautiful drawings of churches and spires and castles and towers. And I get this map. And me, back then, when I started looking at maps, would have got it a whole lot more. And I have a son who's just turned 5, and we came to the RGS together when I got my NES award a few months ago, and we were actually in this room, which is why it's quite funny when I was told we were going to be in here. And while I was going around talking to some people, he stood over there where you can see the scale model of Everest. And I didn't realise he was looking at it, he was playing with it, until Joe Smith came and said, can he not touch it? And I was like, oh God, so sorry, I didn't realise. Anyway, he straight away afterwards asked for some paper because he wanted to draw something. And he decided he was going to draw a map of how we were going to go up Everest. And this is what he drew from that model. And then he talked me through it and explained where we were going to camp. He told me where we were going to have food. And he told me, and this is the really dangerous bit, Mummy, we're going to have to get down this quickly. But he got it. And so I think, you know, a question that comes up, is there a future in maps? He did that without me telling him, go do a map, we're in the RGS, this is what you should draw. He saw that mountain and was inspired to make a map to make meaning of this mountain that he'd seen. And I think he shares his love of maps now. He's always drawing them. He loves, we were in Kew Gardens the other day, he did the Zog Trail. He loved following the map and showing his friend how to read the map and this kind of thing. And it's just a different way of looking at it without rules. You're not confined by rules. And the Gough Map holds another important kind of and pertinent place in my own story. It was actually used, the way I heard about it was more recently, about 10 years ago. It was used by a charity called the British Pilgrimage Trust. And this is a charity who basically are trying to open up pilgrimage to everyone. They have a motto called BYOB, which is bring your own beliefs. And the whole idea is that pilgrimage isn't just about religion. In fact, it never was. Originally, the word pilgrim actually doesn't mean someone who's religious. It means a stranger walking through a field. If you look at I was recently in Italy doing a pilgrimage, and I spoke to an Italian man who said the Italian word for pilgrim means rambler. So it's all kind of got mixed up. But they basically looked at this map, and where everyone else had tried to work out what it did, they said, actually, this looks like one of the oldest pilgrim paths that we have seen. If you look at some of these insignificant settlements they go through, this is on the way to Canterbury. And that's how they formed the Old Way, which is a new pilgrimage of one of a really old route. Even though this map had been described as an enigma. Now, I'm not religious at all, but there was something about this that captured my imagination, this map, this journey, this unearthing an old route that other people had trodden. And I have recently used pilgrim paths to find meaning in my own life and confront old traumas I'd been through. And in short, doing pilgrim paths inspired by an old map like this has helped me find meaning, both in Britain, but also in myself. I think it's like what Felicity talked about they also represent something internally, an internal journey. And as I took time to explore them, the meanings became a lot clearer. And I think, as I said at the beginning, the purpose of any map is to make meaning. And to me, the Gough Map is a great example of a map that does that. And pilgrimage did that. And for me, what we're talking about today, contemporary exploration, also helps us make meaning too. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very, very much for those presentations. I'm absolutely full of questions. And just a reminder that at any point, if you want to jot down a question for later and hold it up, please feel free to do so. When you were talking about your Siberia Land Rover journey and about the blank stares that you got when you asked about maps, it made me think, because I was actually really excited to be asked to chair this panel because before I worked at the RGS, was involved in quite a big surveying project of another part of the former Soviet Union, and I had a very similar kind of experience when trying to find publicly available detailed maps of the area, because it turns out that civilians just weren't allowed access to that information. This was really sensitive political and military information. And I ended up finding this whole subculture of contraband Soviet-era military maps, which I then relied upon to do years' worth of work, and meeting a lot of government officials and making sure I never actually told them that I was essentially using illegal classified information in order to do it. And I kind of thought, well, maybe that could have helped you in your explorations.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, but I like that you've just broadcast out now. I mean, any hopes of secrecy is now over. But yeah, I mean, this was a lot of the reason why. I mean, that northeast corner of Siberia, sadly, I've now lost touch with all of those people because of the changing political situation in Russia as a country. But when we were traveling through, this is a part of Russia that is very rich in mines of all types, from fossil fuels to diamonds and rare earth minerals. And so we did get a sense that by asking for maps, I mean, it was like marching into a room and saying, right, we want your military secrets. And that was not something that had ever occurred to me. I've never had that life experience of living in a political situation like that. So, it was a sign of our ignorance, and one of the reasons why we were treated like idiots. I mean, we were treated like the 5-year-old children that we must have appeared to be when we wandered in. They didn't understand why we wanted to travel across for, why are you traveling across? But to see what's there, to meet the people, that just did not compute, and obviously labelled us as spies.
Spies,
yeah.
Yes. Spion in Russian. Yeah, and I think it says something about our own culture, right? That we take for granted the fact that we can buy, hundreds of editions of a 25,000 scale topo map of our own country. And I wanted to ask you about your experience with the Ordnance Survey maps, especially as someone who's worked with OS in the past, and you've obviously published a lot on what it's possible to find by using OS maps. And I'm keen to hear your take on what it is that the OS maps don't tell us, and actually if the idea is that OS maps are the ultimate source of truth about what's on the ground, where's the space for adventure and discovery?
Well, I think, so my experience with OS maps is, yes, they're a good start point for adventure. We are supremely lucky, like you said. I've been to places like Burma and asked for a map and same sort of, what the hell are you doing, we are really lucky we have them, but in my experience there's definitely a lot of mistakes on the ground. There's obviously a huge campaign been done by the Ramblers to try and reclaim a lot of lost paths, there's so many times when I've been out and been on what should be a right of way and it's been blocked off, and then I'll go and report it. I'm one of those annoying people who then does go and report that because I think that's hugely important, and I've had arguments with farmers and gamekeepers when they've tried to block off my right of way. So I do think that's a really important thing for them, but the maps can only tell you so much. My passion is wild camping and finding very strange places to spend the night in the outdoors to really immerse myself in there. And yes, people ask for my advice, what do I look for on a map? And I'll say, look for a sheltered spot, look for somewhere near a water source. But it's never the same. It's never the same as when you're there and you spot those hidden places to tuck yourself in, and then that leads you to find maybe a cave where you find something and then you stumble. But there is so much more in a really sort of the minutiae of detail which no map will give you, and some of it remains in your head still, I think, that you carry with you. And like we've heard from, when I've done a lot of travel with Indigenous people, it's passed on knowledge. It's, there's definitely been places I've been to and spoke to older residents, and they'll tell me something that I cannot find on the map. They cannot point it out to me, but they'll do a bit like your drawings with the big stone, and they'll tell me, look for this, and then you find something. So I think they're a good starting point, but I don't think we should let them close our mind off to they are the be-all, end-all.
Interesting. So you're essentially saying that they're not in fact complete at all, and we still need to go there.
Yes.
To be able to find out what's missing, and in fact where the intrigue is behind the way it's been rendered.
Yeah.
So I think that leads on to the next question I had in mind for this session, which is about the value of being able to read traditional maps, and especially you both have young children, and we're seeing a new generation of people who possibly don't see the relevance of traditional map reading skills, orienteering, being able to read a compass and take a bearing, and all the rest of it. Do you think it is still relevant, given that the digital alternatives are so much easier to use?
Well, along with being told that you're not an explorer unless you're drawing maps, and there's nothing left to explore anyway, the other thing that I'm regularly told is, well, it's so much easier now because you have modern equipment, so, it's easy. It's not easy. It's still, in the case of Antarctica, just as cold, just as far, just as hard to move across it. But the one big advantage that we have is satellites. Satellites for communication, but also satellites for navigation. We don't have to learn how to use a sextant. We can use forms of global positioning systems to use technology to tell us where we are, and that has, people are very fond of highlighting the negatives of technology, and they're there and they're a concern and we have to address them all. But I don't think we should also be blind to the positives and the amazing benefits that's brought to. I mean, you can, not only can you plan bigger, better, more valuable journeys that bring back more knowledge, more insight, more experience to share, but you can also, value that journey more, because you're finding stuff out as you go, and you can share it almost in real time, and you can share it more accurately. We were talking about accuracy, so there's a whole load of reasons why I think we have to remember the benefits, and also this idea of European mapping being bad because of the whole colonial political baggage that comes with that. These maps were used for things that we now recognise were very bad things. But that system of mapping has also brought about a communal way of communicating that's been used for really good stuff. I mean, in Antarctica, it's front of mind that you've got this whole continent that's been put aside for peaceful international scientific cooperation. And the communal language for that is often maps and mapping systems that each of those countries, I think there's now something like 55 different countries that are active participants of the Antarctic Treaty System. And a large contribution to that has been the fact that we've got this communal language that everyone understood of mapping, of coordinates, of there are benefits too. And I think it's quite right to address and acknowledge the harm that has been done by previous uses, purposes, ways maps have been done, but not to chuck the baby out with the bathwater. Also to recognise that there are things here that maybe we want to hang on to because it would make future better communication, say between indigenous cultures and European cultures. This could be a communal language that would be useful in the future. So I hope it doesn't get thrown out because of the association with its past.
Well, and going back to your point about younger people, so I run a charity called the We Too Foundation, and we take disadvantaged young people on expeditions, and we went to Antarctica in 2022, and we tried to get them interested in maps, and a lot of them just couldn't, they just had no experience with them, like how I was when I was sort of their age, just couldn't get their head around it. But when we got to Antarctica and we went to, one of the places we went on the way was Deception Island, which is classically the one that's virtually a circle, and you go through like Neptune's bellows, this tiny sort of passageway in. And we tried to show them the map, and they just weren't interested. And then when they went in, and you get off the ship, and we took them for a hike up one of the very small mountains, but to them was like the biggest mountain ever. And then we jumped in the water and showed them how the water was warm. We did all that. After they'd had that immersive experience into it, we got them back on the boat, and the first thing they wanted to do was to see the map, to understand what they'd just done. And then they realised how small a bit, this bit that was like the biggest thing they'd ever seen, this biggest stretch of wilderness, and we'd done like this tiny, not even centimetre bit of it for them to get their head around it. And then they were all taking photos of the map on the screen, and then some of them were asking if there was a map they could buy to take back and plot. So I think there is still something of us that needs that physical memento of this, I was there, this was a place, this has some kind of connection to me. The same with the kids drawing the maps, the same with just as human beings. I think, if you look at the Gough Map, it was that way of just, making that meaning, making that just this point in time. And I think that's the point with maps, it is that point in time. The date is very important, and the shifting dynamics of not only politics and borders, but also in Antarctica, ice sheet melting, and it's none of it's permanent. It's all impermanent. So what do we have? The maps are a permanent record of something that was.
Of a point in time.
Yeah.
It's interesting because you've just described the kids you were working with having an experience that led to them then wanting to understand the map.
Yeah.
And you also talked about your own personal experiences with maps, and again, there being a personal reason that came first, and then learning how to read a map came later, after that.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to go back to you, Felicity, and ask, before you got involved in, jet charts of polar regions and what have you, what are your kind of formative experiences and memories with maps and using them or being introduced to them, if you have any?
Yes, we were laughing about this before. It's probably sort of school or Duke of Edinburgh or something expeditions where you're given this unwieldy bit of paper that gets soggy in the rain and you realise 2 hours later you've had it upside down the whole time, or been following the edge of a cliff rather than the path or whatever. So, I've got all of those formative memories, but I have always been fascinated by maps, and I think there's something intrinsic in our shared human experience. If you put a map down in front of people, people will start following that coastline or following that line. And for me, certainly, this has been the starting point, the inspiration for all sorts of journeys and projects, and has gone on to result in friendships or involvement in causes that maybe would never have come about if I hadn't have followed that curiosity of, well, who lives in that part of the map? Or, what is over there, this big empty space? That the map in one of the earlier sections that said unexplored. I mean, and the question was, well, unexplored to whom? And I think that is the fascination of maps, though, isn't it? It's that, you often don't find your own neighbourhood as exciting as you find somewhere that is just a blank space on the map. And it's something that thankfully is changing. We're learning to appreciate.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that and the close to home, because I've done a few interviews with a woman called Marion Shode, who I don't know if anyone's heard of her. She wrote a book before the whole sort of right to roam movement. She was such a key part in us getting the rights to walk, and she wrote a book called Right to Roam and another one called This Land is Our Land. And she was intrigued when she was just out walking. She didn't really use maps, and she wasn't allowed to get into this particular area because it was private. And then she sought the map out to try and find out what was in that. And then that kick-started her passion for, well, do we have a right to go there? Is there a way we can get in? Historically, have we had that right to get in? So actually, it was that curiosity. And that was literally 10 miles from where she lived. It wasn't, you don't need to go to somewhere that's completely unmapped. You just have to have that curiosity in your head. And I suppose for me, with the young people I work with now and what I try and do, it's that curiosity to understand how maps can be a key tool to fighting for something you believe in, understanding something, accessing something that you don't have access to before. And going back to the question about technology and that, if that's people's way in, I don't have any problem with that. I'm not a map purist, obviously, who is like, it's got to be this certain way. I think if whatever piques someone's interest, because we're living in a society where everything's on screens. We're living in a society where we're told it's unsafe to go out there, especially kids. There's so many parents that I know who have kids the same age who are so worried about the fact I'll go out with my son and do this, and there's the fear there. And so I think if people are on their screens, let them use the screens to get into the outdoors, and they will soon stop putting their screens down and using their eyes.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? It's like whatever form that map is. So I now live in Iceland, and there are a lot of the old routes that go across the middle of the island of Iceland. This is some of the oldest archaeology that exists. It's sort of the ruts that were formed by the hundreds and hundreds of horses over the decades that have followed these routes. But that's not a mapped route.
No.
But it's told from one person to another, and it's all based on how far a horse can travel and where the springs are and where you can leave food for the horses for your return journey. And yet that is as fascinating, and the stories that were woven around those directions. So rather than just being told, turn right, turn left, take 2 lefts, walk another, you were told a story instead, and that sort of helped you navigate your way. And that's equally as fascinating as a map that's rolled out on a piece of paper or a relief model like the one out there. It doesn't seem to matter what format the map comes in. It's this idea of having some kind of journey, the songlines of
of course,
the Australian.
Australia,
we find that fascinating, and I think it's a shared human experience, no matter our culture or our personal lived experiences. We all share this fascination with the idea of plotting a route. Maybe it's linked to the idea of sort of destiny and fate and where you're going to go and all this sort of thing.
I almost think that we've benefited from having such amazing mapping, but it's also stifled really that creativity. It's put way more importance on this map, than the song lines, than the stories, than the Icelandic routes, which would have captured my imagination way more than, follow this. And I think that's the key to remember. It's when we're having the discussion about, digital versus paper, or using just a navigation app that's not even based on an OS map versus an old school OS. It's to not be so judgmental about the right way and the wrong way, because arguably they're all a right way for somebody. And if they get people out there doing these things, and that's the catalyst to get them there, to caring about the environment, to want to be a scientist or someone who's discovering things to make things better, that's surely at the root of all of this. That's surely what we're trying to do.
Wow, this is getting quite quite deep. But no, I think what I'm hearing is the map is potentially a key to access somewhere, but then it's the time spent there exploring the area, putting the map aside perhaps, that gives you all those extra layers of meaning afterwards. I wanted to come back to the technology question. I know it's possibly an overdone topic, but the way it looks to me is that as the paper map, as the ultimate source of truth kind of declines, digital mapping seems to be more and more dominated by data that's actually owned by private corporations. So I'm thinking Google Maps and Apple Maps. This is no longer national mapping agencies that are deciding what we should see when we look at maps. It's instead companies that have commercial interests. And I guess I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we can make sure that the places we love remain accurately represented and are not just turned into essentially another form of digital advertising.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is that it underscores the importance of exploration today. I mentioned about there's nowhere left to explore. There's lots of places left to explore, but also I think we've learned that there are many benefits that can come from exploration. And so, for example, if you have someone telling you that this is the way it is out there, then you need someone to go out there and check and say, well, no, actually, you're putting a spin on it. Classic example, when I made a crossing of the Antarctic landmass, so from one coast of the landmass to the other, I was contacted pretty promptly on return by the Flat Earth Society, who told me, you are aware that you did not cross the Antarctic continent. You must have just gone round in a big circle, because otherwise you would have met the wall at the end of the world,
of course,
which I did not encounter. So, classic example of, unless you go there and say, the Flat Earth Society are apparently planning their own expedition to Antarctica, and I think that's absolutely the right move.
Completely.
They need to go there and make that journey and see for themselves. But this underscores the importance of exploration, and in a way the importance of maps, because it is fundamentally a way of recording information. In whatever way we do that, and we're finding, again, talking about technology is allowing us to record information in ever more detail, and that's got to be a great thing, because in how many generations will children be reading about glaciers at school, and there are none left for them to go and experience for themselves? But will they understand what a glacier was just from a load of data about how thick it was, how big it was, how cold it was? Will they understand it more by looking at a map of it, and how maps of speeds of movement of ice, for example, so you see how it's a living, moving thing? Will they understand more when they hear Phoebe's account of camping on a glacier? It's, as human beings, we experience the world in all sorts of different ways, not just in scientific language or in the language of maths. And so that's why I think all these different maps have a way to a purpose and a role to play, because we experience the world in so many different ways.
And the map makers, I think the question is who are the map makers today? We know that there's the Ordnance Survey, we know that there's Google Maps. We also have a job to do, I think.
I think it's us, yeah. I think we are the map makers. We all are, and we can all share that information. That's what we've got, is this ability to share in a way that we never had before. We're so well connected that we do have that ability, and I think having feet on the ground of normal people is really, really important.
And there are real practical reasons why that should be the case. I mean, you mentioned this this campaign to record lost footpaths.
To lose our rights that we have,
The fact that that's happening here in a very well-mapped country.
You can see, I've got 2 OS maps of the same area that are only about 10 years apart, and there was, straight away, the first thing I noticed was 3 footpaths gone. And I went back and said, well, what happened? I can't find anything in the news about these being closed. Why would they have been closed? That's just one example of one map. And I think it's so important to push for it and to be out there. I think maps are beautiful, and of course I can read maps now and I can see the beauty in them. And I think things like what OS has done with their app, where you can actually turn it 3D and move around it. I don't know if you've used this, where you can actually take put it on a flat surface and then move it, and it actually shows what it looks like. That's massive to helping people understand what contours are in that. But I think there's nothing that will ever beat the feet on the ground, making the maps for ourselves. I don't know about you, but whenever I've done a walk, like, I come back and I've got notes everywhere on where things are wrong, and because nothing is ever 100% right.
But isn't the important first step the fact that we're recognising that maps are made by people that have an agenda? And we were talking earlier about colonialism and how maps have been used for all sorts of negative impact reasons in the past. And the fact that we are now acknowledging that and saying, okay, we need to remember moving into the future that this is what can happen, that I think is an important first step in perhaps preventing that having such damaging consequences in the future.
Yeah, I mean, we can be asking the same question of what we're doing now, right? Saying about deleting footpaths with no explanation whatsoever. This might be seen in the future to be an example of maps being abused. Who knows? Yeah. But we need to keep using them and making them for...
Where you were doing yours, and in Siberia, maps were power. They were a currency. They were the military only, because that's how valuable the data is now. And then I think if I have a rant to a friend about this footpath was missing from the thing, and they're like, oh, for goodness sake, but that's how it starts.
Well, a more contemporary example, the renaming of the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes.
I mean, on different maps. And it just goes to show how easy things can be manipulated, even today, when we have all this awareness of it. So we can't afford to ever not be vigilant. And this is why telling stories about the past, why history is so important, isn't it? Because we need to be on our guard for it happening again.
And even going back to Wales, there's the nameless coombe, which actually isn't nameless. It's just no one could say the Welsh name of it. Oh. And there's a real push to get rid of the nameless coombe and actually use the Welsh name. I mean, it's a huge, and I'm originally English. I grew up in Wales, but I am English, so I always sit between. I'm not quite English enough to be Welsh, or I'm not Welsh enough to be Welsh, or English enough to be English. I sort of sit in the middle. But things like that are important. The Devil's Kitchen, the Welsh name actually means the black hole. It has nothing to do with the Devil's Kitchen. That was an anglicised interpretation of it. So I think, keeping going back and asking questions is always the thing to, why is this the way it was? Is this right? Can another name tell us more about it? And especially with this awful Gulf of whatever he's calling it. I don't even want to say it.
Okay, well, this seems like a good moment to switch gears slightly. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I do have a few questions, so thank you to those of you who jotted them down. The first one's for you, and it does kind of lead on from what you were just saying. And it's about what for you would an accurate map look like in your ideal world? What else would it have on it? And the examples here, would it have sounds, smells, stories attached to it? Any thoughts on the idea?
I think it wouldn't just be one map, is what I would say. I think it would be a multitude of maps. I would love to see a map of a place that's done by someone who knows it well, who lives there, versus a map of someone who's just come and seen it or how they've interpreted it. I'd love to see a really old map compared to a really new map. I'd like to look at the change that has happened in both paths in places. And yeah, I think when I go and explore somewhere, I actually close my eyes at some point. I do stop and make sure I'm not on the edge of a cliff before I do that. But I do close my eyes and I stop and I do smell and I do listen and I try and use other senses to really place myself there. And I think all those things they're so important. And I think there's nothing wrong with maps that we have, but there's also nothing wrong with having alternative maps that we have and embracing a place as more than just one thing. And the fact we're humans and we all interpret things differently.
And I'm just to kind of follow up on that, for both of you, how do you use map making now in the way you communicate your courses, your expeditions? Does it kind of play into this idea that you can use it to tell a story as well as scientifically represent a place?
Yeah, I mean, during an expedition, we use maps as a source of motivation every single day. As I was saying, you plot yourself on the map, and it's not just me doing that. When I'm out there with teams, it doesn't matter if this is their umpteenth expedition or their first. We all have this need to be able to plot ourselves so we can see our progress, and that's a form of motivation. And then when you return, this idea of proving truth. The first thing, particularly when I crossed Antarctica, one of the first things I was asked for was my daily coordinates so that people could plot out my route and use that as a form of evidence that I had done what I'd said I'd done. And when you look back at some of the historic polar journeys, there are plenty of people still poring over the data on maps left behind by some of those famous explorers to try and either prove or disprove that they did or did not do what they said they did.
You know, that reminds me of, I don't know if anyone's heard of this book called Meet Me in Kathmandu. I got it from a bookshop in Kathmandu, and there's a woman who would keep people's recorded when they said they'd been up Everest, and she would interview them. And she wasn't looking for plots on a map, she was actually looking for them to be able to describe features that you'd only know if you'd been up there. And that was almost, she's seen as the god. There's some people who are people accept, no, they couldn't have done it because she said they didn't. She'd never been there. She just knew it from interviewing all these mountaineers that did do it. And sorry, that just reminded me of that. It's really quite interesting that there's definitely that proof side of it. From our perspective as a charity working with young people, if we tell a sponsor on a very materialistic level, we're going to go to this place and do this, they go, oh yeah. If you show them a map, it seems to make it more official for them. Rather than just telling them, it's showing them. And then, like I said, what we tend to find is the young people don't want to look at the maps at first, but afterwards, they all want that physical proof.
Yeah, to put themselves
to be able to say,
on
that's where I was.
So a follow-on question again to what you were just saying. The question here is, how should maps and mapping, and I think there is a huge difference between map reading and cartography here being brought explicitly mentioned here. How should it be taught to young people if they're not automatically inclined to be interested? How do we change that? Is it just about making sure there's world maps and globes littered around the house when they're growing up?
You asked me a different version of the same question before we started, which was, do you think people should bother learning things like magnetic deviation and all that sort of thing anymore? And I honestly think no. I mean, unless you've got a reason to learn how to use a sextant or how to, literally navigate by compass, until you reach that point where you need to learn that skill, then, don't burden people with that. I mean, it would be much more useful for people to be able to learn how to store all your data points in an FTP file so that you can share it easily and then plot it on a 3D Google Map so that you can share it through your website or your TikTok account or wherever it is, so you can get people invested in. I do get slightly technology. I'm not the biggest technology expert, but I try not to be a complete Luddite. But the biggest thing of that, I think we do have this prejudice against, because there is so much bad stuff about new technology, we have a prejudice against using it and recognising the massive benefits it can also bring us. And as I shared with you both before, I'm looking forward to the day when we have one of those Star Trek maps. You know, when you press a button in a room and it explodes out this dome of a map that you can walk into and look around. You know, can we hurry up and invent that, please? Because I really want that.
I would say it's getting people out of classrooms. I think if you look at where I grew up and how close we were, to be sat in a classroom, not understanding a map, being explained about how landscapes were formed, and if they'd have taken us there and shown us, and classic example, there's a peak called Tryfan in North Wales, which is mini Tryfan, which no one ever goes to. It's basically by an old sort of quarry. But it's where Darwin went and came up with a theory about, how the landscape was formed. And I could see it, I could actually see it there. But we're never encouraged to go there. And there's been a real kind of, everyone's got to be in the classroom. They've all got to learn it this one way. We don't take them out because there's too much paperwork, there's too much risk. But that's exactly what we need, is to get them out of the classroom and inspire this feeling that the landscape is for everyone, and however you understand it, you need to be there to understand it.
This reminds me of a project I was involved in a few years back. This was in Armenia, and I was helping run a workshop at a extracurricular institution, and we were teaching kids how to contribute to open source mapping of their home country. And kids were coming from about 25 villages in the area around this one town where the centre was. And as soon as we put them in front of a screen with a satellite image of their village, they were like, oh yeah, that's that so-and-so's house, here's the post office, this street has got this name. And these 8 to 10-year-old kids created more accurate and detailed mapping of their own country than had been done in 50 years.
Wow.
Uploaded it to OpenStreetMap, and now anyone who goes to visit Armenia will be following it. So I'm kind of tempted to suggest that maybe not teaching people how to read a compass first, but showing them how they can be cartographers as well as users of digital mapping at an early age. Maybe there's something in that.
Definitely, yeah, I think, yeah.
Any further thoughts? Let's move on to something a little bit more pragmatic. And this is for Felicity. So, don't look scared. It's very simple. What do you do if the battery runs out or you lose connectivity? And I think this is about actually, do you still need the backup of old school navigation?
Yeah, I mean, particularly when you're around poles of any description, geomagnetic, magnetic, geographic, inaccessibility, whatever, navigation becomes really complicated. So you cannot totally rely on any one method of navigation. So you can't rely on maps, because there aren't any, or the maps you do have don't have anything on them, so it's not terribly useful. You can't rely solely on GPSs, for example, because you'd need endless battery power, and even if you have solar panels, you've got quite a few things that are more important than your GPS, like your satellite phone, for example, that you need to keep charged up, and your camera. So you can't, rely solely on something that runs off of batteries or needs power, but neither can you rely completely on a compass because things like the magnetic derivation and things just becomes too complicated. It changes too quickly. You would have to recalculate, so quickly. that it's not practical. So you find a kind of happy medium. You know, you do a pinpoint location with a GPS, because you can't do that with a compass or by any other means. But then you create a bearing, and you can use a compass to walk along a bearing, and it can keep you pretty much in a straight line. But then you can also use things like your shadow. You have to be aware that the sun is moving, so you have to check that you're still going in the right direction every hour or so. But even things like the direction of the wind. I mean, in Antarctica, it's always windy, and the wind just comes from the same direction, not just for hours, but for days, sometimes for weeks. So you know, okay, I keep the wind coming across my right shoulder, and I'm going roughly in the right direction. And because you are moving across a vast empty landscape, it doesn't really matter if you're slightly off course for a little bit. It's gonna make no difference. So, you know, as long as you're keeping a rough eye on it. So the answer is that you use a combination of everything that you've got, from you know, natural pointers in the landscape around you to the most modern technology you've got.
So yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is that, as well as the maps and the skills to read them, there's a whole other skill set involved in navigating a landscape, some of which has actually nothing to do with the map at all, and everything to do with being able to read the elements. And
well, I'm not sure. I do agree with you to a point, but I think, you know, you need to be able to look at a map and interpret what that map is telling you. So whether that's a map that's showing the different rates of movement of different areas of ice. So it's not a topographic map, but it's showing you the movement in the ice, and you see places where there's a lot of movement, then that's where there's going to be lots of crevasses. So I don't want to go there. So I think, you know, if you're just relying on turning up in a landscape and navigating your way across it, yeah, that's got nothing to do with maps maybe, but I think that's a much harder and perhaps more foolhardy task than if you've, you know, got some kind of information from maps, or from asking people around you. For example, in northeast Siberia, when we were about to travel for, you know, 4,000 kilometers along frozen rivers, you know, I think it would have been unwise not to have tried to get the information that was available from the people that we met along the way, because we could have quite easily got into really serious trouble.
And I think, just to start wrapping things up, on the same kind of lines with the, I guess, the digital tools we now have, has your role as a polar explorer become more about helping cartographers improve the mapping that's available? And I'm just thinking of the map that you showed in your presentation, where you were relying on what somebody saw in 1966 to inform your contemporary journey. Is that now still happening? You yourself and your peers, are you feeding data into mapping agencies' charts now?
Yes and no. So, I mean, now we live in the age of satellite observation, remote sensing, and that has given us far more extensive and more detailed and perhaps more precise or accurate information than an explorer skiing across the surface could hope to provide. But as I referenced before, you know, that gives us an overview. There are certain things that you need feet on the ground to be able to detect. So, for example, in some recent journeys, we've been taking snow samples to look for things like light-absorbing particles, things like black carbon, and in my case, airborne microplastic. These are things that we can't yet detect from remote sensing. And this is why I find it so fascinating that there are huge areas of Antarctica where there has been no footfall yet. And some people go, but we know what's there because we've looked at it from satellites. We know exactly what's there to a very small scale. But I think, well, we don't know what we're missing out, what information we're missing until we've been there. And it might be that someone that collects some snow goes, do you know what? There's loads of microplastic in this seemingly pristine snow that's come all the way from Northern Europe. And that could open our eyes to the fact that there's a massive pollution problem here. And so it's very hard to predict what we might find. And again, this underscores the importance of exploration and the importance of maps, because maps is the biggest key to recording that wonderful information that you discover.
Yeah, and I guess layers of data on top of the, let's say, traditional topographic maps. And I guess in a way that's what you've been doing with some of your publishing recently, is you're reinterpreting the OS maps and the places that it leads you to in new ways to help other people do so. Is that the kind of the path that you're still continuing on?
Yeah, and just like I said, seeing them as a good starting point. It's not throwing out the old for the sake of the new. It's recognizing their value, but also their limitations. And it's using them to do exactly what you said, to use them as a start point to say, okay, what else can we do? And then, like I said, using them to gain more rights, more access, to be vigilant, to report footpaths that are blocked off, to report things. You know, when I take my son on a walk and something's like, look at this is really bad, I'm going to take a picture, and do you know what we're going to do? And just instill this thing, like, because look, we can't get through, and that's hampered this walk. And it sounds like something really small, but we used to do this really lovely walk from Henley, where we'd get the train down one stop and then walk on the Thames path back, but the bridge doesn't work, and this landowner had given us permissive access for 2 years, but then withdrew it. And he said, Mummy, I'm so annoyed, that was my favourite walk. Can we write a letter to someone to make sure we get that access? And it's like, because he's been there, because he's seen it. It's not because of a map. The map was the starting point for me to plan how could we do this, because he loves trains, he loves the river. But actually, then that's inspired something else. So I think that they're so key, but how people interpret them has to be different. The snobbery over, there's only one way to read a map, and this is the only way, and your ways are just a pie in the sky, airy-fairy. Like, no, it's all important, because really the aim of them is for us to go and be there and explore and I mean, it's the whole reason the RGS is here in the first place. You know, the whole reason the maps were made is so we could get out there. And I think it's really important that the ways to do that doesn't hamper people or put barriers up in front of people who are not given the time, the patience, or the resources to be able to understand how the maps work.
Well said, and I think the slow jazz there was a...
That was a nice little, just to wrap up the...
So a really big thank you to both of you for sharing all of your stories and experiences. Round of applause, I think.